Today I have with me Kumars Salehi. He is the host of the audio-based podcast Delete Your Account, and he's also a visiting assistant professor at University of Pittsburgh's Department of German. Kumars, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Navid. First time, long time, as they say. I love what you guys are doing.
Kumars, and here I have to remind the audience that your name is Kumars or Kumars if you want to anglicize it a bit, because some people call you Kumars, and I'm like, Kumars is not really your real name. I understand, if you speak English, it's very difficult to get your name correctly in the, I think English phonemes and pronunciation is just very difficult to say the word Kumars. But yeah, it's a very beautiful name. It's actually the name of the first human in Iranian mythology. So similar to how Adam and Eve are the first humans in the Judeo-Christian Islamic stories and histories. Kee-you-marss is the first human in Iranian mythology. It's a very beautiful name, and yeah, I encourage my audience to get it correctly if they can. Similar to I don't know if you remember the New York City mayoral debates.
That's right.
So Mamdani started correcting Cuomo. That's a hard name to say too, Cuomo, and he kept saying that it's Mamdani, Mamdani. He's like, get it correct, because we have
you
to.
said the name is Mamdani. I related to that. I mean, I have a lifelong friend. I don't want to put her on blast, but I just let her call me Kumars because I didn't correct people. I thought of myself always as a little bit of a radical, I think, but I never in my own life corrected people about pronunciation of my name until very recently, probably college, I would say, and now I still have the sort of correct mispronunciation, which is Kumars, and then there's the other mispronunciations that are less acceptable.
Kumars, you have a very interesting story because you're a brown guy, Iranian origin. You're also a Palestine solidarity activist, but you found yourself in German studies. And I don't think that's a common combination, because I think generally my presumption is that most people in German studies are of a white descent, and you probably don't find too many Palestinian solidarity activists in German studies either. So tell us, how did German studies and Palestine activism came together for you?
Honestly, they didn't come together until very recently, unless it was in a negative capacity, really, because when I was first getting into German studies, I kind of switched paths midway through grad school, and I was already a pretty prominent Palestine activist, Palestine solidarity work with SJP that I was doing in New York. I continued in Berkeley, where I finished my graduate studies, and people knew coming in, but they didn't know how crazy my views were, right? So the advisor that I had, a very sweet old man, very smart. I learned a lot from him. One time very early on in my studies, I wrote something. I actually wrote it in German I don't think I really thought it through, but I wrote it sort of for the department paper. And it was the summer of 2014. It was something about, the fact that Germany has a lot of work to do still. I don't think I was anywhere near where I am in terms of my analysis, but the basic idea was Germany has to stop gaslighting everybody about its relationship to Palestinians. And my advisor told me that night when he read it, he couldn't sleep because of how much we disagreed. And in the time that I was in grad school, and I was in grad school for a while, he later had a couple of conversations with me about it and let me know at one point, for example, that I was right. He was like, hey, I know you're right, just in general about the issues related to Palestine. But I'm German. He said, I have these liberal friends in Tel Aviv, etc. And I think we've heard versions of this spiel from a lot of people, but in Germany, it really is. Scholars have called it a catechism. It's like it's a dogma that you recite. The liberal friends in Tel Aviv, if they didn't exist, Germans would have to invent them because they're so useful in explaining why they have to constantly hold back on any criticism of Israel, and on the contrary, let all sorts of demonization of Palestinians slide unchecked. So, when I was there, I was also, just targeted by Islamophobic groups, by, anti-Palestinian groups. David Horowitz, may he burn in hell, recently departed, a neocon and fanatical Zionist, once did a poster campaign where illustrations, not even photos, of like the big bad guys on every campus of the West Coast and I think some other places in America.
And you were in it, I remember. But they made you look very handsome. I remember it was an extremely handsome illustration. So
they did. In fact, they played up my beard. Another parallel to Zohran, where I believe this was also, there was some sort of like photoshopping that was done to one of his pictures. They made my beard a lot longer in the picture, and it actually inspired me to start growing it out longer. And I honestly am grateful for that. But it was me. I was the only graduate student on that poster. It was folks, I'm sure know Judith Butler, the critical theorist, and also Hatem Bazian, who was a very important figure in the Palestinian community in the Bay Area and in scholarship in Middle East studies. And there were different people on different campuses. So this was the Berkeley campus. When stuff like that would happen, my department was supportive of me. And I absolutely would not want to give the impression that like the response of like German studies academics in America is identical to, the far right forces that have led the charge on anti-Palestinian repression in the last, however long I've been alive and then more. But in Germany, and this is something that we can get to, and this is a problem because German studies is so closely coupled with what German society over there actually thinks. What ends up happening is that liberals over there, anybody who studies German as a discipline, as a culture, language, etc., over there, institutionally, there actually isn't that much daylight between what they say and what they think, what they're willing to do and enact on a cultural level in their institutions and in their politics, the way they vote. There isn't that much difference between them and what we would consider pretty reactionary racist folks in the United States. And there's like tons of examples of that we could go into. But Germany really does present a sort of developmentally backward case, even in comparison with like other Western backers of Israel. There's still so much more room for Palestinian identity, to say nothing of politics and organizing and action, in a place like even the United States, even under Trump still maybe, but certainly more broadly in the Western world, Germany and the German-speaking world, German-speaking Europe have been an outlier, and that's affected my career too. So that my advisor told me pretty early on that if I wrote about Germany and Palestine, something like what I'm writing about now, not my specialty, I would say, in terms of what I was, allowed to really get into, I think, but I've developed all of this knowledge as an organizer over the years, also practical experience, but I like to keep myself informed. And so even though I was told that nobody would sign off on my dissertation and I would never be able to graduate if I kept this up or included anything to do with Palestine in my scholarly research, I did eventually scale back, but I also got a different advisor. And I do think that now the purpose is clear. I mean, it sounds a little like, oh, it was fate or whatever, but people thought I was crazy. My mom thought I was crazy for going into German studies as somebody who already had a very Googleable and damning record of Palestine solidarity.
Yeah, Canary Mission is one of your honors.
That's right. I think that's still the second or third result that comes up when you Google me. It's like if you print it out, it's like a 20-page long file, and it's all from 10 years ago. So there's been generations of files on new activists that have come and gone since that time. It would be amusing actually if it were updated, but now there's a whole site specifically for faculty. So I'm waiting to get on that one.
It's so bizarre though, because now they're even including like OnlyFans stars. Because there was that Muhammad guy who has a big like Twitter following. I think his handle is like Mark Bar Amrika or something. And he's an OnlyFans star, and he was included in the Canary Mission list. And I'm just like, what is going on here? Like,
to be fair, I think he was probably a student activist before he was an OnlyFans star. But yeah, I think they cast a wide net, and I think that this sort of repression is going to continue. So far, I'm in a really good place. I love where I work. I feel really supported by my colleagues at Pitt, and that's all I could really ask for. I think you said the other day, there's like, and people often say this, like they can't even believe I have a job. I honestly can't believe that I have a job. And don't worry, if you can't believe it, there's still time. I'll be unemployed soon, probably. But the privilege, I think, of having stuck through all of this and maybe having kept my head down in terms of my research. I mostly write about philosophy. I'm more of an intellectual historian, really. And I write about continental philosophy, especially Marxism and the Hegelian tradition, currently working on a book about Nietzsche and conservative thought. But that's a privilege that you then have to use. And we've talked about this before as well. After October 7th, I felt like there's really no point in hoarding any of the social capital that any of us have gained by not bringing Palestine into our work. And so you just have to bring the firewall down at the end of the day, especially if it only works one way. I'm still getting denied jobs because of my Palestine activism. I might as well throw it on my CV now. And now I organize with people who are also like-minded, younger, but not exclusively, German studies academics in North America and beyond. So I'm now a member of the group. The group name is a little long, so bear with me. But we call it DDGC, the Diversity and Decolonization in the German Curriculum, and we have a sort of they call it a research co-op called Germanists for Palestine. Germanist doesn't mean that you think Germany is like very good or something. Germanist just means or it shouldn't.
You study it, yeah.
It just means you study it, yeah. Like Orientalist or whatever. I consider myself an Occidentalist of sorts. And the other group that I'm working with is a coalition of women in German. We have a BDS working group that actually passed what I think is, to my knowledge anyway, the first ever academic boycott resolution by a German studies organization or an organization of German studies scholars anywhere in the world. I mean, maybe there's something in Southeast Asia or something that I don't know about, but certainly it's the first time that anyone in the field of German studies has gone on record saying that Israeli institutions with ties to the occupation, which is all of them, should be boycotted. That's a very big step from where I was. It would have been inconceivable when I was being lectured to tone it down when I was a graduate student. It was inconceivable that we could have conferences. We just had our first symposium between Women in German, WIG, and Germanists for Palestine. We brought together folks that people listening may even have heard of, including Ali Abu Nima, Fatih Nimr, co-founder of decolonizepalestine.com, along with a lot of other Palestinians, Palestinian German feminist scholars, and solidarity activists. And that's the sort of thing that I was told would never happen. Just like with everything else that's happening, everybody involved might still, get their careers terminated, or it might end up on a blacklist or whatever. But it's the first wave of something, and I, for one, feel like without knowing it, I spent my whole life preparing for this moment.
That's right. And no, I mean, it's also very impressive that you've thrived with your Palestine activism in Germanist studies. So this is a very interesting story, very commendable as well. So I'm glad you shared it. But going more from the personal to the broader political situation. So my presumption is that, and I don't have clear data, but based on what I've heard from you and others, is that German politics and German academia are very much pro-Israel in a very kind of robust way that we were saying, much more so than the American one, because at least in America, within certain pockets of the humanities and the social sciences, you see a lot of pro-Palestine sentiments. And I feel like you might actually be the pariah or the outcast in the department if you have very strong pro-Israeli sentiments in some departments in the humanities in the US. And I mean, not in a way that you would be excluded or kicked out, but then the kind of the general opinion is that Israel is an extension of Western settler colonialism in a sense. And you see this within many humanities departments now in the US. But I think, like you were saying, the German case might be different. But also, I mean, the reports I was seeing last year in 2024 was that Germany is now requiring naturalization applicants to sign commitment to Israel's right to exist. And I think, I mean, this is a euphemism for occupation and apartheid and all that, Israel's right to exist, which they also asked Mamdani during the mayoral debates.
That's right.
But yes, I mean, if those reports are true, that now you actually have to commit to Israel's right to exist, which is comparable to the pledges that people have to sign in certain U.S. states, or even with the federal funding now, with federal disaster funding, that you cannot boycott Israel. And if you boycott Israel, you will not receive contracts or will not receive federal funding. In a similar way, Germany is making it impossible to become a German citizen unless you commit to Israel's right to occupy and expand and conduct its apartheid regime. So I think those are true. So I can comment on that, whether they're true, and also comment on whether my presumption is correct that German political and academic environment is more pro-Israeli than anywhere else in the West.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say on that second point. On the issue of immigration, the specificity of this, the German case is very interesting, because at the same time as Germany is supposedly very concerned about the rise of the right wing in their country, and I mean the real neo-Nazi right wing and not the Christian Democrats who are they're not exactly progressives themselves. And the overall, I think, trajectory of anti-Palestinian racism and legislation in the last 10, 15 years could be seen as, I think, an empowerment narrative of the far right. And in a way, it's just another version of the story of how the far right in the West has been able to take advantage of the political situation where center right and center left parties in the West have been bankrupt, at least as far as, popular opinion and buy-in. And since about 2008, it's actually been sort of codified. Angela Merkel gave a speech in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, in 2008, where she declared that Germany had a special historical responsibility to Israel and the security of Israel, and that this was actually part of West Germany, or the Federal Republic of Germany, which is now not West, but all of Germany, that this is part of that state's raison d'etat, or Staatsräson, as they say in Germany. And that basically elevates it to, honestly, a level of existential equivalence, where, there's so many instances of this, but politicians will regularly say stuff like, Israel's right to exist is our right to exist, right? As long as Israel is around, we have legitimacy as a moral actor in the world. Maybe even, I would say, and we can get into this because it's a big sort of historical point, we can maybe even continue pretending like we weren't a colonial power, like we're not still benefiting from the imperialism that was done, that the Holocaust is not itself imperial genocide just carried out in the borders of Europe. These are all things that the anti-Palestinian ideology, that's basically the zero level in Germany. It's almost just part of the social fabric, rather than something that just exists in the minds of individual people. It's almost part of the social contract in West Germany, that the only thing that Germans have to apologize for is killing specifically Jewish people in the Holocaust, even Roma and Sinti and other groups, even other minority groups outside of ethnicity. The queer community, for example, have had to fight to gain recognition as victims as well, in part, I think, because Israel is essential to modern Germany's understanding of itself as having redeemed itself morally for what was done. In terms of the actual sort of landscape of politics, what ended up happening was that when October 7th happened, a wave of right-wing calls from the then out of power Christian Democrats, as well as the Alternative for Germany, so the far right that everyone is supposed to boycott, came out for really harsh changes in the laws regarding things like citizenship, allowing for people to be denaturalized and deported, in fact, for posting things like "from the river to the sea" in an Instagram post. There was a very famous story of a young woman. She was a girl really at the time that she became famous, Reem Sahwil. She had a sort of a tearful exchange with Merkel at a town hall on what they called the refugee crisis, where it was actually pretty heartbreaking. She broke into tears, asking why it was that she wasn't allowed to stay and learn with all the other kids in German school, and why people had to be sent back. And Merkel basically says, well, this is just the way that, we have to run a country, basically. And when she sees that the girl is crying, gives her a little hug. And this was somehow remembered and continues to be remembered as a really proud moment, or a moment of real liberal welcoming. They called it Willkommenskultur, welcoming culture, this embrace supposedly in Merkel's case, literally of immigrants in the 2015-16 period. But it was actually Reem who, in the fall of 2023, posted on Instagram a little meme or a little picture of Palestine from the river to the sea was the annotation. And immediately you had confidants for Angela Merkel, people who had been in her party, who had been with her the whole time, saying, take her passport away.
It was the same girl that Merkel hugged.
It was the same girl that Merkel hugged. And she's going to be fine, thankfully. But the legislation that was called for in order to make, right now they're saying that you can't strip somebody of citizenship in the sense of denaturalization. That's maybe where the current legislation falls short. But the agenda of the far right and the conservative right, the mainstream conservative right, was then enacted not by that faction of German politics, but by a coalition led by the Social Democrats and Greens under Chancellor Olaf Scholz last year. Scholz also, just to give you kind of an example of, at the very least, how the center left in Germany is it ends up tailing the right in maybe even more horrific ways than the Democrats in the US. Arms exports to Israel went up tenfold immediately after October 7th, again, under a center-left government, supposedly, between the Libertarians, the Greens, and the Social Democrats. At the same time, there was a huge tightening of immigration in terms of restrictions. And you had this liberal come out and say, we have to finally, I'm translating from German here, but it's finally time to deport in grand style. And so October 7th really allowed for liberals to participate in, I wouldn't say it necessarily worked out for them, but they certainly attempted to capitalize on anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment by playing into these tropes. Yeah.
But then yesterday there were reports, because you said that even under the more left-leaning coalition, they increased the military equipment to Israel tenfold. But yesterday I was reading reports that for now they're halting some military equipment exports to Israel. So that's an interesting development too.
That is a development. That is an interesting development, but I would say that I would note that there was an election in Germany, within the last few months, we've now had a conservative government come in, led by Friedrich Merz, who actually is one of the more right-wing figures in the CDU. I think that there are broader, European trends that apply to Germany that reflect, I think, the fact that at least rhetorically, if not in any materially meaningful way, some of the European countries, as people already know, are starting to come out and be a little more critical of Israel, like the list of, I don't know what it was, 20-some nations, European nations, North America, Australia, et cetera, saying there should be an end to the genocide in Gaza, in not exactly in those terms, but that there should be a Palestinian state, et cetera. Germany wasn't on that list. So even in a lot of the cases where Europeans are paying lip service to the value of Palestinian life, Germans still hold back. And that's an overall trend, obviously. And so there's going to be some push and pull, but I would be careful about attributing what's happening now to liberals per se, just because they are a part of the government, but not leading it right now.
But then, so you're saying that the momentum to halt some military exports came from the conservative governments? Is that right?
No, I mean the momentum. What I guess this is how I would put it. It's easy when you're out of power to push for measures like this. So I think that in the case of the US, we also saw something of a shift where after Trump came in, it became all of a sudden Trump's Gaza Riviera plan that was the cause of concern for liberals who had not been particularly concerned before. I think that with the new conservative government coming in, liberals have actually found it easier, especially Green Party affiliated liberals have actually found it easier to create some space between themselves and the German state and to criticize some policy on that basis. I think the Social Democrats, even though they are a junior partner in the coalition, also have a lot of grassroots momentum and some people who do want to move in the direction of at least where the other European countries are. And I don't think that that's something that's unique to Germany at all. I think that in a way, those are trends that you can see whenever election results like this sort of change the balance of power.
In a way, it's more reactive than it would be some sort of principled position on stopping starvation or genocide. But I mean, my reading of it too is that it's probably a temporary thing. It's not, that meaningful because, I was thinking of this analogy in my head yesterday, similar to how like immigrant parents, like after they fight with you and you have a fight at the home and they, without like apologizing or talking about it, they just like bring you some dinner or they bring you food or they like yell at you and they're like, dinner is ready. So that's a way of kind of like resuming the relationship. And I think the same thing will happen with Germany and Israel in this case, that, after a couple of months, they're going to fully reinstate the military exports to Israel and not even talk about it, not even have a conversation about it. In a sense, so it's like that dinner plate that the immigrant parent gives his or her child is going to be similar in this case, that Germany is just going to be like, okay, just take the military weapons and let's not even talk about it. Let's not talk about the starvation or the genocide. We couldn't really change your behavior by limiting some military exports. So we're just gonna, restore.
Yeah, there's also, and final note on this, there's also always this sort of Nixon China element of these things that like it's possible that this sort of action would never have been able to occur under a government that was not led by conservatives, if for no other reason than people would have been more skeptical of it. But yeah.
But speaking of rights politics, right-wing politics, and that's in the German context, I'm curious because within the U.S., I mean, what we have is we have the more kind of contrarian right-wingers, and some of them are very attached to the idea of white replacement, the idea that, multiculturalism and immigration is causing the erasure of the white race. And some of them blame it on the Jews. They said that it's a conspiracy that they had devised, that the Jews are planning white replacement. So at the same time, it's weird because, I mean, they're very anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli, but also anti-immigration. So, and all of that is coming together. And I mean, they might seem to be supporting Palestine at some level, but I think it's, in a way, it's opportunistic because they're using it against their hatred of the Jews. So is there a similar thing in Germany?
I would say there's a little bit of a quirk to Germany in this respect. I completely agree with your analysis of the broader trend in the US. It actually is kind of like a strongly European tendency. I think it's more in line with European like ethnic nationalism than the way that American conservatives have traditionally talked. I mean, there's always been anti-Semitism, but just like in America, or probably actually a lot more so than in America even, the right has not fully gone in that direction explicitly. And part of that, I think, is really just the heightened sensitivity that that there is around anti-Semitism in the public discourse, and so a lot of things have to be a little more coded than they might be otherwise. But the reality is that the sort of usefulness of Jewish people for a party like the AfD, and there's even sort of like a AfD Jewish caucus, the Alternative for Germany, the far right party, is really that they provide a really good excuse for anti-Muslim racism and anti-immigrant racism. And so, yes, I think that the underlying theory or the trajectory of this kind of thinking is the same almost everywhere that Europeans have been racist. That eventually, if you think about it hard enough, you're going to get to the conclusion that all of these people of color could not possibly be responsible for, the plot to destroy Western Christian civilization. There has to be somebody actually smart, actually capable, like white people, but evil. And that's always the appeal of anti-Semitism. And it was that they're like white people, but not Christian. And so they're still sort of, there's almost like a proto idea of race already in, Christian anti-Judaism during the Middle Ages. But to the right in Germany, the idea of like Judeo-Christian civilizations, I mean, we heard a lot during the War on Terror, is a really useful fig leaf. So you don't see as many open Nazis opposing Israel, even on superficial terms, the way that we might think that right-wingers in the US are now. You're more likely to see, I mean, there's literally posters of this, people basically saying like, I'm a Nazi for Israel, which is something that, you don't have to have a PhD in German studies to see the problems with and what they really mean. So yeah, there's a double side to it. On one hand, Jewish people are considered this sort of collective oppressor, the puppet masters of immigration to the West. But on the other hand, the idea of Jewish safety, especially if it's conflated with Israel, is really useful to the right. And it's useful both in terms of justifying their own violence towards immigrants and people of color and particularly Muslim majority backgrounds, but not exclusively, in Germany. And also, of course, they view Israel as fighting the good fight over there. In the same way that I would say that in a sort of anti-colonial lens, we see Israel's utility as a sort of attack dog against national sovereignty in the Middle East, in the global South more broadly, you could think of it as. And, they also see Israel that way, but in a good way.
The honorable German chancellor, the current German chancellor, said, I mean, going off a journalist question, kind of like feeding into the journalist question, he said that Israel is doing all of us dirty work when Israel had attacked Iran during the 12-day war. So yeah, I think, and I think that sentiment is shared across the political spectrum in a place like Germany, where they see they're on the side of Israel against a country like Iran, even though it is Israel that has engaged in an unprovoked, expansionist, and destabilizing war.
Yeah, and you can really see that at the end of the day, this is mostly, I would say, a recent development in my thinking about this, but I really think that the decolonial framework is the one that allows you to see the full picture here. Sometimes when people talk about Germany and Palestine, they kind of make it sound like Germans are just kind of being anti-racist in a misguided way, or that like they've somehow taken like denazification too far, and that's why they are so racist against Palestinians. And I think it's like, it's always bears repeating, especially when we have a political environment where like people have forgotten what racism is. So they're like, oh, like the far right is doing white identity politics. And I'm like, that's called racism. Like, I'm sorry. So you have to kind of sometimes stop and say, anti-Palestinian racism is rooted in racism, not in some kind of anti-Semitism or like wokeness run amok, right? Like sometimes I think people talk about Germany as if they're doing like state wokeness, and that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, as we've already, and we can go into a lot more of the history if you want. I know we've already talked quite a bit, and I want to be brief if I can, but the truth is that Israel was actually pretty essential to the way that Germany avoided denazification. West Germany, I mean. East Germany is a whole other story, and we might need a whole other hour to talk about it. But in the Federal Republic, I mean, the Federal Republic of Germany in the Cold War was a garrison state. It was a pro-Western garrison state to hold back the tide of socialism and decolonization. And they did that by supporting Israel. They did that by supporting apartheid South Africa, who they committed no historical crimes against. In fact, they had committed genocide against the very people that South Africans were then occupying in what is now Namibia. They called it German Southwest Africa before it became South African or apartheid South African occupied. And that legacy of racism is something that they've been able to really hold off any acknowledgement of, to say nothing of accountability. Like obviously, like even in the United States, there's been no meaningful justice or accountability for white supremacy, like on like a structural level, but you can at least talk about it. And in some ways, the intensity of the silencing of Palestinian perspectives in Germany, the fact that even a kind of a mainstream outlet like Der Spiegel, maybe you could consider it equivalent to the New York Times or something, will just straight up title a video or an article about pro-Palestine protests, protests against Jews, right? Like they'll just label it. And so like that is what I mean when I say you really have a far right level of racism normalized at like a societal norm level.
But it is called white identity politics instead of racism.
Exactly right. But these are all American concepts. Racism, identity politics, they don't have anything to do with Germans. Yeah, so that's a big problem too, is that when they don't see what they actually do and think as racism, they're even more easily able to avoid the question.
You know, I mean, this is one of the, I think, bizarre developments of the recent decades is that, I mean, you used to be proud of being racist. So if you were a white supremacist or a racist, you could be proud of it and openly declare your racist intentions and statements. But I think in the recent decades, because of the rise of anti-racism, I mean, I'm talking about the American context here specifically that I'm more familiar with, but because of the rise of anti-racism, the civil rights movements, and also identity becoming a big thing, the various intersections of identity that a person has, I think the white supremacy and white racism has adopted this new approach where it's very much rooted in victimhood, and it's in a way they're appropriating the discourses of the subalterns and the oppressed and the marginalized and the BIPOC people and all that. And they're saying that we're the one who's actually being victimized because of, say, immigration and multiculturalism. Our culture is being erased. So it's a really bizarre appropriation that has happened. And I mean, even David Duke, the KKK guy, I mean, he went from, I think, being an open racist to now all he talks about is being a victim of, multiculturalism and, all that. So I think because racism has become so unacceptable, even groups like KKK are in a way appropriating the victimhood narrative instead of just saying that, we're these open racists. And I think that's part of the reason that, like you're saying, they don't, that kind of feeds into what you were saying too, that they don't call it racism, but they call it white identity politics. So I think that's a really bizarre development.
Yeah, in the German context, I would say they wouldn't even apply the term white identity politics. They would just say this is like xenophobia, right? As if like people from Ukraine get the same treatment as people from Syria. there's the first black member of the Bundestag, Karamba Diaby, he's Senegalese born. During the sort of summer of 2020, he sort of came out and made some statements saying, stop saying that you're xenophobic. I think this is probably in generally a European thing where they just don't talk about race like that as much. But I think it's particularly bad in Germany, in part because of like the fact that like they don't really think of themselves as a colonial power the way that like England and France were. They don't think of themselves as like deserving to have these like large minority populations, and so I think there's a bigger there's a lot more space there for denialism, I think. And he came out and said, I've been here for fucking 35 years. Like, you're not xenophobic if you don't think I belong here. And one thing that I would probably caution you on in that analysis of the appropriation of left-wing tropes by right-wingers in this case is that I think the idea of white people or the dominant class, apparently, or Christians or whatever, as the victims is actually like very deeply rooted in the conservative tradition and in mainstream European self-understanding. So the fascist threat, for example, that was perceived, or the threat that was perceived by fascists, by Hitler, by Mussolini, etc., it was never explicitly formed in the, in the context of we are just naturally superior and we can just leave it there, right? So I don't know if there's such a hard line between open racism and the invention or perception of a threat that actually means you're the real victim.
But then what's an example of, say, the Nazis or Mussolini or the fascists claiming they were victims?
Well, I mean, you can, in fact, if you go and listen to a lot of the speeches by, basically everybody, but Goebbels is one who comes to mind. The idea from the very beginning of Nazism was that German society had been infiltrated by Jewish people who were not, this is the same in France, obviously, Jewish people who were not really loyal to their nation. And the blame for World War I, for example, was placed on the supposed Jewish officers who negotiated the capitulation of Germany in that war and the horrible terms that led to such great crisis in the Weimar Republic. This was seen as a threat from Jewish infiltrators, basically, who really controlled everything. And of course, they also saw Judaism, Jewish people collectively, as responsible for communism and the threat of the Soviet Union. And I think it really gets lost in a lot of the scholarship.
You still see that. I mean, the right-wing discourse that I was describing that you see on the internet, to this day, they claim that Jews devised and planned communism, and it was a Jewish plan. And I should clarify something here. When I'm talking about the right-wingers here, I don't mean people like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owen, who have a criticism of Israel. They don't go into the anti-Semitic tropes. I'm talking about more the marginal elements within the right wing, and most of it you see on the internet sphere. They get fully anti-Semitic, and I think it's actual anti-Semitism, because now we hear allegations of anti-Semitism. They call the Columbia students anti-Semitic.
I don't think Candace Owens is the same boat. I think that there's a slippery slope, and she's on the way down. And then you could look at somebody like Nick Fuentes, for example. Like, I don't know how much daylight there really is between them, maybe when the mics are off. But I take your point. I do think that the continuity there, though, is important, because the idea of white Christian Western civilization as being under threat from an actually more powerful, or at least more dangerous and existentially threatening outside force, subaltern maybe, but with all powerful puppet masters. That I think is something that you can probably trace back to the beginning of far right politics, of fascist politics, and maybe even further back, right, to ideas about Jewish people, even in the era of the Enlightenment and so on.
No, that's very interesting. And I mean, it's a good caution or a good correction, because a lot of times, and this is a problem I think generally with interpreting history and politics, is that you presume something is new. Like I just presume that the appropriation of victimhood, or the idea of victimhood, that the dominant white Christian race in the West is victimized, is new, and just maybe spans a couple of decades. But now you're saying that you can actually trace the history back, and I think a lot of things that we presume that are new, they have much deeper historical roots.
And to tie this back into what we were saying before, maybe I'll just kind of put a bow on this point. The ethnic nationalist conception of the nation state, which is the European model, right? You have civilizational states that we can think of, like Iran, like China, et cetera, that don't have ethnic homogeneity as sort of a premise, one language as a premise. But the Europeans thought of their countries this way, right? So it's really easy for them to, even now, right? Like Germany has only had birthright citizenship for 25 years. And the year after they instituted it, they cut welfare dramatically and basically gutted their support for people who were unemployed, for example. And I think that the sense of victimization that people feel in the case of immigrants coming in and kind of ruining Germany is really easily channeled into anti-Palestinian racism, because Palestinians themselves sort of they stand for what cannot be acknowledged in German society. They sort of show that the West German, or now German, idea of moral redemption, this kind of narrative of who we are now and why we still get to tell other people what to do and what to think and what a feminist foreign policy is. We should all enjoy our new UN General Assembly leader, because she's really one of the most hawkish. Again, great example, Green Party politician Annalena Baerbock, probably just as hawkish, if not more, than the current chancellor. And she was the foreign minister in a liberal government. So to me, that is a really big. It's a sort of a combination between a willful race blindness and a need to, I think, not see the modern German nation state as tainted irrevocably. Because once you start saying, listen, it wasn't just killing one ethnic group in one instance that you have to answer for, then all of a sudden you get this sort of affective ideological short circuit, and no, it's too complicated to talk about. And that's if they're polite. Otherwise, you might just get taken to court for chanting or wearing a keffiyeh.
That's right. Yeah, and so there has been plenty of repression against pro-Palestinian activism in Germany, as you recounted. But something else that you mentioned during your last comments about West Germany's support for apartheid South Africa, and also the Nazi crimes against many different groups of people. So because the theme of this show, the Colony Archive, is colonialism. Can you say a little bit more, as someone in German studies, because we're all very familiar with the colonial history of places like France and Britain and even the US, but we don't hear as much about Germans' colonial history. And I mean, it's probably much smaller compared to the French and the British. But I think they did also have a colonial history and also participation in settler colonialism. So, can you tell us what is Germany's role in colonial history?
Yeah, this is a huge part of the story. I mean, Germany was slow to become a nation state. It wasn't unified until 1871, but pretty quickly, I mean, people are familiar with the so-called Congo Conference in the late 19th century, presumably, where Africa was divided up between a number of European powers. Germany began its formal state colonization campaign then in the 1880s. And in many ways, you could see imperialism in the Holocaust and in World War II as sort of a release valve, or I don't want to say, on some level, I think that they were backed up. They were, they had imperialist blue balls because they wanted to, I mean, in some ways, they also didn't really want to have overseas colonies the way that France and England did. They really wanted to have a big old empire right where it made sense in their own Lebensraum. And because a lot of the good getting was gotten before, they were really able to conquer a lot of the world, they really went to town on these German colonies. And some of the worst treatment, I mean, you can think about Belgium, right? Belgium didn't own that much of the world, but what they did in the Congo was some of the worst things that anyone's ever done. Maybe as bad as the Holocaust. I think that's like a crazy thing to be dismissive of. The things that were done were comparable or precursors, certainly. And in the case of Imperial Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm, the crimes were direct precursors. So during what was considered to be the Second Reich, the Second Empire, German Empire of the Wilhelmine period, there were about 100,000 people in the Nama and Ovaherero tribes in what's now Namibia, who were, I alluded to this earlier, but I didn't elaborate, who were exterminated. This is over 80% of the Ovaherero and 50% thereabouts of the population of the Nama tribe in Namibia.
This is the early 20th century?
Yeah, this is in the early 20th century, between 1904 and 1908, where that roughly that figure, about 100,000 people were exterminated. This was not, something that you could look at and not see the connection to the Holocaust. They were death camps. They were gruesome medical experimentation. And I think that it really is symptomatic of the failure of Germany to reckon with its colonial legacy, that we don't see a continuity. In fact, for the longest time, and I think still to this day, Hitler was basically kind of treated like an exception, and the National Socialist period was considered an exception in German history. And I think even now that we've gotten over, Germany has somewhat moved on from the theory that Hitler was basically an alien who was like beamed down to earth and like tricked everyone. Now they've moved on to this idea that it was everybody's fault, but only during that specific period of time. And you can really tell that this was how it went, first of all, because of how little accountability there was from the Allies.
So Hitler, so for the longest time, they viewed Hitler as a Jeffrey Epstein, because now they see Jeffrey Epstein as a lone actor.
Yeah, exactly. And now I think it's really more this idea that we just kind of went crazy, or Germany did, and it doesn't really it's not reflected in any of the behavior of the German state before World War II. I mean, Weimar is its own thing, but as we mentioned, the imperial activities in Africa, and it's not consistent. It's not reflected in what happened after World War II, when you had a prime minister who was a high-ranking Nazi official in the 50s. In the 60s, you had a chancellor. That's the main kind of, executive position, quasi-executive. It's a parliamentary system, but that's the main, head of state, who was a high-ranking Nazi, Kurt Kiesinger. They even recently did a study, I think maybe 10 years ago or so, where the Justice Ministry in Germany did a sort of a internal review of historical documents and found that a super majority of people in the German Justice Ministry in the 50s were Nazis, had just stayed there. And, you can then see obviously how in the context of support for apartheid South Africa, where they in fact had a cultural exchange program, the only one in the whole world with South Africa. Nobody else in the whole world during the Cold War had a cultural exchange program with South Africa, but instead, in those same territories where they had committed genocide in the imperial era, they built schools, they sent their own students to study in, again, occupied South Africa and Namibia, and their institutions adhered to the local race laws. In fact, there's I was looking at some of these records, and there's an essay that was written by a student at the West German funded German, they call it the higher private school, basically an elite academy. And he basically wrote a defense of South Africa's anti-miscegenation laws. And the quote that really stuck with me was, "Lions do not mate with pigs." And to me, that's not a country that is denazifying, right? That's not a country that is at all reckoning with what it actually did during the Holocaust. And I think that the refusal of Germans, you might hear this and be confused by it, but the refusal, I think, of some Germans to even acknowledge that anti-Semitism is a form of racism, or that the Holocaust was fundamentally wrong because it was an act of racist violence. These are not commonly accepted in German elite spaces. Racism is actually sort of considered, again, to be something not particularly German, and all Germans are responsible for is anti-Semitism, which is not racism, which means they can't be racist. And if you accuse them of racism, you're actually being anti-Semitic. But it really does look, if you take the historical view, like West German society, to which current Germany is the inheritor, decided that they could be so racist in a way that nobody would notice their anti-Semitism ever again. But that isn't working very well, unfortunately, because the same forces that have been empowered by the crackdown on Palestinian political activity and self-expression are the same forces that actually are pushing the hardest against any kind of positive, constructive engagement with the memory of the Holocaust. So the AfD has actually explicitly campaigned on curbing Holocaust memorialization, and they described Berlin's Holocaust memorial in 2017, the year that they entered the Bundestag, for the first time a far-right party had entered the Bundestag since the end of World War II. Their leader, who's now incredibly popular, described the Holocaust memorial in Berlin, which you may have been there, as a monument to shame. And he called for a 180-degree turn in our politics of memory or remembrance. And again, you can see their influence in the landscape today. They were, just like with the situation with taking away refugees a naturalization status. If they criticize Israel, the far right AfD was actually the party that first introduced a ban on BDS that passed the Bundestag in 2019. What happened was that when they introduced it, everyone was like, hey, this is a great idea, but we don't want to vote for your bill because you're icky. And so what they did was they just came up with an identical bill, and you can read them side by side, like the Bundestag has this all next to each other, and they are identical basically, except that one bill was introduced by the AfD and failed because nobody was willing to vote for it. It's outside of the AfD. And the other bill was introduced by the other parties, and the AfD voted for it. And so who really won in the end? Right?
It reminds me of that meme where there's a American bomber under a Republican administration, and they're just throwing bombs. And there's an American bomber under a Democratic administration, and they have like the LGBTQ flag, and they're dropping bombs. So this is kind of a similar situation. But yeah, I mean, so you spoke about Germany's relationship with South Africa and even the cultural exchange programs that they had. Can you tell us if you know of similar instances between Germany and Israel now? Do they have like a robust? I mean, we talked about the military exports that Germany gives to Israel, but in terms of the cultural sphere and maybe the universities, do they have major collaboration?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the relationship in terms of cultural exchange couldn't be stronger. In fact, you literally have politicians and journalists and activists volunteering, German-born people volunteering to go serve in the IDF. It's like a normal thing. Taking little glamour shots, visiting and taking little glamour shots on a tank, and signing missiles, all of that. I will say that a final point on the South Africa thing, Germany even helped South Africa in their quest to get nuclear weapons, and had to withdraw their ambassador to NATO after it was revealed that he had actually visited one of their uranium enrichment facilities. So yeah, Germany has been willing to go very hard. The West German state was actually the primary supplier of Israel in terms of military and other aid until 1967, when the sort of polarization of the U.S. and Soviet Union in the 1967 war changed I think the calculation of the U.S. administration a little bit, and they ended up becoming what they are now. But for a while, it was the West German state. Right now, I think that the connection between Germany and Israel on an institutional level is so deep that I don't even really know where a BDS campaign there would begin. But yeah, it's basically the German academic landscape, the German cultural landscape, whether you are talking about a film festival or you are talking about a university, the overwhelming priority is that any discussion of Palestine happens on terms that Germans and Israelis are comfortable with. And it doesn't even have to be real Israelis. They could be like imagined Israelis in German people's heads. But the truth is that the real kind of appeal of Germany to Israel, outside of obviously the material support and it's nice having somebody who kisses your ass all the time, is that Germany has actually become a place where liberal Israelis go to escape the tyrannical Netanyahu government, where they get to go and so in Berlin there's this judgment-free space, I guess, where all you have to be is slightly to the left of Netanyahu, and you can say, oh, I'm this enlightened political refugee. But that's part of the, I think, it's important that you bring up the cultural symbiosis, because I think that's also part of the problem, is that much more so than in the United States, the spaces that we traditionally consider to be places that are liberal or bastions of liberalism, arts, education, etc., are also sort of in lockstep with expectations, sometimes that even exceed, but are certainly in hang very closely to the norms and ideology of Israeli society itself. So you're really not likely to have that much daylight between an Israeli leftist and a German leftist on Israel, except that the Israeli leftist might actually be marginally more critical.
Yeah, and I mean, what's crazy to me is that both in Israel and in a place like Germany, whenever they want to criticize Israel, they just criticize Netanyahu. It's similar to the Epstein thing again. That you're like, oh, there was just one evil guy who was a pedophile and he was evil and he trafficked minors, and you stop there. And it's similar with the so-called dissidents, and you said the enlightened Israeli leftists who goes to Berlin for refuge. I think it's similar where they're like, there's just one guy, it's Netanyahu, and is a bad guy, and they just stop there. And as if the ethnic cleansing in Gaza is just something that Netanyahu wants to do, or maybe his close associates want to do. So they don't look at the broader structure of, Israeli colonization of Palestine that has a much longer history. And I mean, I've been seeing it even I was listening to the BBC World Service on NPR. I think NPR, broadcasts the BBC World Service on certain hours. And any kind of criticism they do of the starvation in Gaza right now, it all comes down to, Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the guy who's just pushing it a little bit too far. And yeah, it's just so pathetic. But I mean, playing the devil's advocate here, and trying to put ourselves in the shoes of NPR, the BBC World Service, German intellectual culture, or the Israelis, uh, or actually more the Germans in this case, not the Israelis. But would you say that there might be is there any reasonable argument for equating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism in the German context because of their particular history and them committing the Holocaust?
I think that the obvious answer is that you can criticize Israel in a way that is anti-Semitic, and that's always going to be a risk, right? Like, I'm not one of these people that thinks anti-Semitism is a useless concept going forward. I think it describes a tendency in white supremacy that is very real and recurring. And I do think that criticism that, whether it's in America or in Germany, that sees Israel as a problem of Jewish people, and not like sort of other way around, that like Israel is in many ways not representing all Jewish people and has become a distortion of what the legacy of especially European Jewish people has been throughout the last centuries, and especially since modernity, which was a very progressive one. And of course, that's to say nothing of Middle Eastern Jewish communities. But I do think that understanding anti-Semitism better is important. So it's actually funny, at the University of Mannheim, they did a study, I think this must have been a year ago at least, where they actually they basically polled people or surveyed people's political views, and sort of cross-referenced that with perceptions of their anti-Semitism. And what they found was that there is a correlation between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, but only on the right. So that, like, this goes back to a point that we made earlier, that in fact the main threat to Jewish people in Germany is, and this is backed up by government data, 85 to like 95% of attacks against Jewish people or perceived anti-Semitic attacks. So this could actually also include things that we wouldn't consider anti-Semitic, like Free Palestine or whatever. Still, 85 to 95% of those are committed by white right-wing Germans. And yet the focus of the discourse in Germany is anti-Semitism as a problem for the left, as a problem of like the post-colonial internationalist left, as opposed to like the German left that is in solidarity with Israel.
Or the problem of black people, because I just remember the movie Straight Outta Compton, and there's this really funny scene in it where the manager, who is Jewish, after hearing Ice Cube's song "No Vaseline," where he says that you got a Jewish manager, and he disses the manager. The manager comes to Eazy-E and says that Ice Cube is being anti-Semitic, and then Eazy-E is like, black people don't know what anti-Semitism is. Like, as this is not our issue. Like you're saying, it's mostly the white right wingers and certain pockets within the white right wing. So not people like Tucker Carlson, but others who are very anti-Semitic, and they're, like you're saying, their criticism of Israel might correlate with anti-Semitism. But then what I think they do is that they start transferring that, or gaslighting the post-colonial scholars and the student protesters and black people, Ice Cube, and being like, you're the anti-Semites. So that's again a very bizarre phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far into that example, because we would go on a tangent. But I will say that it is particularly notable that not only did this study show that the more right wing you are, the more likely it is that you are anti-Semitic, it specifically showed that the least anti-Semitic contingent or demographic in German society were educated young left-wing people, i.e. the same students who are constantly being accused of being the new Nazis. And this really is the sort of the projection of, I think, Germany's conservative cultural identity, that we can't be the Nazis still. And not only do other people have to suffer, the Palestinians, but those also are the new Nazis, right? Because that makes it so much easier to say, listen, it's Palestinians, it's their American friends who don't understand what anti-Semitism is. It's Greta Thunberg, who was like a huge celebrity in Germany. She could have probably been the prime minister or whatever, chancellor, if they had let her. But now she's a Hamas sympathizer, and gets torn apart in Der Spiegel, and just like hit pieces, like really gruesome stuff that you wouldn't probably see written about Greta Thunberg in even the New York Times, as much as we might dislike that paper. I think that function of demonizing other people as the real Nazis plays again into that sense of victimization, that we worked so hard to create a perfect, morally reformed German society, and now these brown people are invading and ruining it with their anti-Semitic opinions, right, or their criticism of Israel. I think that's an important thing to bear in mind, for sure.
That was the first part of my conversation with Kumars Salehi, who is the co-host of the podcast Delete Your Account, and also visiting assistant professor of German at University of Pittsburgh. You can catch the second part of the conversation, which is about German intellectual history and might interest the more academically minded part of our audience, in a future episode. So stay tuned for that episode, but meanwhile, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel below, and also follow us on Instagram and TikTok.